Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best RNG cards in the game. Starting off at the number 10 spot, it is the Hunter Minion Fiery Bat. This has become a popular opening move for a variety of different Hunter decks, and the great thing about Fiery Bat's randomness is that it's, first off, low impact. It only ever does one random damage, so it's not something that can go crazy like a Knife Juggler. But also, the effect is delayed. It doesn't have the immediacy of something like a Knife Juggler or a Flame Juggler, which you typically control when the knife is going to affect your opponent. With Fiery Bat, since it does take a turn to attack and therefore activate, your opponent has some level of control over how they answer this randomness. For instance, they may not want to play a 2 health minion and a 1 health minion on the same turn because the Fiery Bat could theoretically kill them both. They might instead just play a 2 health minion or just play a 1 health minion and find ways to work around the Fiery Bat. So when you're able to put some of that control back into the hands of your opponent with a slightly delayed random effect, that's really good. So this card ends up being pretty balanced, still popular and strong, but not frustrating to play against. Moving on to the number 9 spot, it is the Mage Spell Kabbalists Tome. This one is very random. There are 3 random effects happening, and the total variance of those random effects is big. You can get 0 mana spells up to 10 mana spells. So there's a lot of different stuff going into this, which is typically bad when you're talking about randomness. You don't want a ton of variance. That can be dangerous. But that's okay with Kabbalists Tome for 2 reasons. Number 1 is that it's relatively expensive and your opponent knows it's coming. So you play Kabbalists Tome, you're basically sending out a warning that says, look, some randomness is on the way. You have to be prepared for some craziness. And it costs you 5 mana to obtain that randomness as well. So there's a sort of time or tempo penalty. And secondly, with Kabbalists Tome, is that it's not immediate. Right, it takes some time not only to play the spell initially and lose that tempo, but also to play the next 3 spells. They also require time and mana to get out there, so your opponent has even more time to react and adjust. And they still won't know what they're going to get, but that's no different than a card in your deck. They don't know your deck list necessarily either. Essentially, the delayed factor of Kabbalists Tome and the sort of predictability, or at least counterability of the card as well, makes it reasonable even though it's got a ton of variance built in. And now for the number 8 spot, it's another mage spell, but this time it's Arcane Missles. Now this one is relatively random. A lot of different stuff can happen, but the great thing about Arcane Missles randomness is that it's often just as likely to backfire for the person playing it as it is for something crazy to happen. Sometimes all 3 missiles will go to the opponent's face and they won't kill any minions. Other times they might all go to a 3 health minion and kill a really high value target. So there's a fine balance there, and that's still a lot of variance. That's sometimes what makes randomness frustrating. But in the scheme of things, it's only ever going to do 3 damage. And 3 damage just isn't that high impact. It's not going to change the fate of a game that significantly. Yes, it can make a small play, but it's really not that different than say running a Frostbolt, right? It's a targeted 3 damage versus a random, slightly cheaper 3 damage. It's still only 3 damage, unlike Knife Juggler, which could theoretically be an infinite amount of damage over the course of a game. Arcane Missles is only ever 3 damage, outside of some spell damage effects and so on and so forth. But it's so low impact that despite some variance and despite some unpredictability and despite a lot of immediacy in its effect, still just isn't going to change games that significantly that often. So it's not super frustrating to play against, even though you do get those big hits and big misses some of the time. Now for my number 7 card, it is the Warlock spell Soulfire. The great thing about Soulfire's randomness is that it only affects the player playing it directly and immediately. Now what I mean by that, of course, is that when you discard a random card, sometimes you discard the Doom Guard that you really, really wanted. Other times you discard the Possessed Villager that you didn't really care about. One of those is really good, one's really bad. There's quite a bit of variance there. There's a lot of spread in the quality of those effects. But your opponent has time to react to that. They have time to see that. They realize your Doomguard is gone, so they are happy sometimes. Even if your Possessed Villager is tossed away, they might be disappointed that it wasn't a super high value thing, but they can't see the rest of your hand anyway, so they don't necessarily sense the variance like they might with many other cards. It's not quite as obvious, so to them it doesn't feel unfair or unbalanced. And for you, the person playing Soulfire, there's a really cool risk-reward gameplay decision element here. And the more control and the more strategy and intelligence you can put into a random decision, the better it's going to be. And this is a card that very much forces you to do that. So you're deciding when to be random, and it feels much less like a random effect and much more like a potential punishment for a very intentional decision. So Soulfire ends up feeling like a pretty smart random card, which is a pretty cool change of pace. Moving on to my number 6 spot, it is the Warrior spell Brawl. Now this one can sometimes be frustrating, I'll admit, but the thing about Brawl that makes it acceptable in my mind is that there's so much predictability behind this card. If you're playing a Warrior deck and you can sense that it's a control archetype, which is usually very easy by turn 5 when something like Brawl will be played, then you know Brawl is always a possibility. You know it's a card they're very likely to have in their deck, and it's something that you can play around. You can choose to hold a minion. So yes, it's a high variance. You can win big or you can lose big. It's still something that you have some aspect of control over, and that's very important to making this card feel reasonable and not too unbalanced. Plus, it's a slower card. It costs 5 mana. And there is a downside to Warriors playing it from time to time. It means they can't really have a deck, or at least an early game plan, which loads up the board with minions, because that means the Brawl is just as punishing to the Warrior as it is to their opponent. So there's a sort of check and balance system here with Brawl as well, which helps tone down that high variance. On to the top 5, it is the Paladin spell Avenge. This one might be a surprise for some people because there has been a time in the past with Secret Paladin decks where Avenge did feel a little bit oppressive and didn't feel all that random, because typically there's only ever 2 minions out on the board with those kinds of decks, and you pretty much knew what was going to be receiving the Avenge a lot of the time, thanks to things like Noble Sacrifice into Mysterious Challenger, and Avenge landing on Mysterious Challenger a lot. So it doesn't necessarily kind of stand out as a random card to a lot of people, but this is technically a random effect. But the reason I don't mind it being a random effect, the reason the RNG isn't all that punishing, is because you do, again, give your opponent a ton of control and predictability with this card. They get to determine when they set off the secret, so they know it's about to happen. They can also clear minions in a way that sets up the Avenge to land on something that they want, so another aspect of control there. And they can choose to just ignore the secret too if they don't want to deal with it at all, so you give them sort of an out to not deal with randomness at all. But in the end, the predictability and the lack of immediacy make this card completely tolerable in my mind. For my number 4 card, we're heading back to Mage, and this time around it's Spellslinger. Really, this one's pretty obvious why it feels like a fine card. It's because the random effect is symmetrical. That means it affects you in the exact same way that it affects your opponent. There are also a handful of ways this card is like Kabbalists Tome from the previous spot on the list, in that it's not usually an immediate effect, particularly when played on turn 3. You have to wait a little while to play that random spell in your hand. Plus, you're giving your opponent a chance to see that it's happening and prepare themselves for whatever random effect might be coming up next. And now for the top 3, and a card that might surprise some people. Raven Idol is my number 3 card. Now, you might be saying, well, wait a minute, this is a Discover effect. This isn't random at all. This card doesn't say random anywhere on it. And that's true to an extent, but even Discover effects are random in that the 3 cards that show up on your screen to choose from are randomly selected from some other pool of cards. They're not even within your deck, so you don't even control the pool that it's being randomly selected from. So it's a random selection of a random set of cards. But the fact that it is Discover and you get to choose which one you take is what makes Discover such a great mechanism for controlling and mitigating randomness. So even though I chose Raven Idol at the number 3 spot, I really kind of wanted to just call this the Discover mechanic. Raven Idol being my favorite card to pick from all the different Discover cards, because not only does it have the one level of mitigated randomness in that you get to choose the actual card you end up with, but there's a second layer of choice as well with Raven Idol, and that you get to choose between a minion or a spell. So you're actually introducing a lot more variance because of all those decision trees, minion, spell, and then the 3 cards within each group. There's a lot of extra randomness there, but it's even more control. And when you can control randomness to some extent, or at least introduce some aspect of control in that randomness, it really helps the card feel smoother and safer than a lot of those immediate crazy impact random cards that we typically see. Moving on to my number 2 spot, it is the Warlock Minion Void Color. Now this is a card you probably haven't seen a while if you've been staying in standard format, but I love how this card treats randomness because, again, in a similar vein to a lot of past cards on this list, it puts so much control in the hands of your opponent that you're giving them a lot of different decisions to make. So yes, there's a random effect. Yes, it can have a ton of variance, but your opponent gets to decide when and how to handle that variance. Now that said, of course, you can kill your own Void Caller sometimes, and that takes the decision out of your opponent's hand, but they often have an entire turn to react and think and deal with that. So it gives them some options and some decision trees to make and gives the result some predictability. So even if you do end up getting that Mal'Ganis out of your Void Caller, maybe they saved up a Shadow Word Death, maybe they saved up that big game hunter instead of playing it once they saw that Void Caller. So a random effect that can do a lot of cool and especially fun things, but it's not typically an immediate effect. And it is somewhat predictable as well from your opponent's side of things. So despite the variance, despite the high impact nature, this card still feels balanced and within the realm of reason as far as RNG is concerned. Here it is. This is my number 1 card, the best RNG card in Hearthstone, and not the first time that Sylvanas Windrunner has topped one of my top 10 lists. The reason I think Sylvanas Windrunner is so good, it's really quite similar to the previous card, Void Caller. It's that when you play Sylvanas, you're really giving your opponent full control of how this card is handled. They know there's a very strong random effect, but you're giving them the time and the decisions on how to answer Sylvanas Windrunner, which is really important. You'll find that opponents often have some sort of way to deal with Sylvanas in order to mitigate their losses and limit the randomness. You know, they might play 4 or 5 really small minions so that you don't steal something big, so that you're less likely to take advantage of a big variance swing of getting something like a Ragnaros instead of a Silverhand Recruit. You'll also note that there is some risk to Sylvanas' randomness if you're playing her yourself, and that this effect sometimes just doesn't do anything. If you have to play Sylvanas Windrunner on an empty board, there is no randomness. It doesn't do anything at all. Your opponent can just kill it with a fireball and move on with their day. So the randomness only works some of the time, which is a nice limiting factor to making her frustrating in every time she shows up as well. The only time Sylvanas actually has any immediacy to her effect is when she's somehow comboed out with other cards. For instance, you might see a Warlock play Sylvanas Windrunner into Shadowflame. But the thing about that is, typically that's not even randomness deciding anymore. That's just a really strong play from your opponent. They might pull that off, kill all the little stuff on your board, and then steal your Ragnaros. That's not randomness. That's a really smart, controlled use of resources. So even in those instances where Sylvanas does have an immediate, powerful impact, it's not randomness that's beating you. It's just deck construction and resources, which is a whole different thing that feels totally fair, and that's what Hearthstone is really all about. All that said, it should be pretty clear to anyone who's watched me for a while that Sylvanas Windrunner is definitely one of my favorite cards and a completely accepted bastion in the Hearthstone meta basically forever. There are occasionally some complaints about this card's randomness, swinging games and deciding tournaments and so on and so forth, but it's still well within the limitations of what I'd expect Hearthstone to be. And remember, this is a game that's all about drawing random cards from a deck. A little bit of randomness is healthy for the game. And Sylvanas Windrunner, even though she sometimes toes that line, just is powerful enough, cool enough, and limited enough in her impact that, by God, she might just be the perfect example of an RNG card in Hearthstone. And that'll do it for my list. Those are the 10 best RNG cards in Hearthstone. I'm sure you think my list is crazy and that I got it all wrong and that I forgot some awesome RNG cards. There are some more out there. You also probably think that I'm crazy and that Sylvanas is terrible for the game. In either case, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please do leave a comment below with what your take is on the 10 best RNG cards in the game. But until next time, thanks so much for watching, and game on.